How often have you experienced moments of extreme distress or extreme discomfort? Maybe difficulty focusing or thinking or completing tasks, or maybe even feeling like you might be having something like a heart attack. What we're going to talk about today is what's known as a trigger. Triggers are something we talk about in the mental health community that refers to very sudden onset and difficulty focusing, thinking, or responding. A trigger often has and is linked to physical responses in the body. This could be intense feelings of anxiety, increased heart rate, maybe even sweating. What happens is that these triggers occur almost seemingly out of thin air and from nothing. Then we end up having an emotional response. When experiencing a trigger, it may feel as though you don't have any control in your response to that trigger. That's often the case.
Before we can talk about how to manage your triggers, we have to talk about what triggers are to begin with. So, what exactly is a trigger? A trigger is something that reminds you of something bad or traumatic that has happened in the past. Memories have several different components to them. If you look back at something you remember, there's pictures, there's sounds, there's smells, maybe even tastes, and sometimes even body sensations that are associated with different memories. When you're triggered, what happens is that one of those specific reminders comes up in the event that's going on in the present. When that happens, you start to feel like you're back in trauma time, or almost like your body is taken back to the space where that bad thing happened. The tricky thing about this is you might not be consciously aware that this is what's going on. Instead, what you might be able to observe on the outside is that suddenly your emotions seem out of control and you're responding in a way that doesn't seem like it actually fits the situation. But when it happens, it will feel completely reasonable to you. You'll feel like your emotions are totally in response to the situation and that they're not out of control. Sometimes it's only in hindsight that we realize that our emotions were maybe more intense than they needed to be in the situation. So, how can you recognize if you're getting triggered? One of the things that I think is really important is to be constantly aware of different body sensations that are happening and to the emotional energy that you feel. So if you notice suddenly that your body gets tingly, lots of times people start to notice they lose feeling in their hands or their feet, and they start to feel like their emotions are suddenly really, really big. Those are good signs that you've been triggered. So when you're feeling triggered, it's important to stop and remind yourself that you're not actually in trauma time. Where you are is right here, right now. This can be more difficult than you think, and Jaden's going to share some ideas about how to do this in just a minute. But before we do that, let me tell you just a couple of other things that may cause you to feel triggered. It's not always as clear-cut as you think. It might just be a specific feeling. For example, often people will be reminded of or triggered by a car accident, the memory of a car accident, just when the feeling of not being in control comes up. When the car accident happened, the person felt completely out of control. And so then when a completely unrelated situation comes up in the future where the person feels out of control, their body is reminded of what it felt like to be in that car accident. Then you might find yourself in a state of hyperarousal, or maybe you know that as like fight or flight. When that happens, it's likely that you've been triggered. All right, well, stay tuned for just a minute. Jaden's going to talk you through some ways that you can use some grounding so that you can feel better and manage these triggers more effectively.
When we talk about triggers and big emotions, an effective way to manage some of that can be using what we call grounding techniques. Grounding techniques are things that bring us present and bring us now. A lot of times when we get triggered or if we're feeling really anxious or anything like that, our thoughts are not here and now. We've totally checked out, or we're in a situation in our heads that is so much bigger than the real situation we're dealing with. So grounding techniques can be really effective for bringing us into the present, bringing us into the moment, and realizing that all we have to deal with is what's happening right now. Grounding techniques are helpful because a lot of them can be done anywhere you're at. Let me give you a few examples. One that I really like to suggest to people is to start describing the objects in the room around them. So if I were to do that here in my room, I would say there's a kind of a gray wooden desk. It's got 4 black metal legs. There's a camera I'm looking at. It's mounted on a stand. There's a laptop over here. Just start describing what's around you, what it looks like, what it probably feels like. And when you give your brain a task like that, it can't also be somewhere else worrying. It can't also be somewhere else upset. This works because our brains are not good at multitasking. When we give it something to do or something to think about, it helps us be really present because it can't be wandering off wherever it wants. There are some grounding techniques you're probably really familiar with or have heard before. Things like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, naming 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, kind of using your senses to bring you present. Those are just a couple examples of grounding techniques. We're going to be coming out with some shorts talking about a few more of those, and as well as in the description, we'll post a link to a list of some other good grounding techniques if you want to try them. The important thing when you think about finding a grounding technique that works for you is trying lots, trying repeatedly, trying really quickly, trying for a long period of time, and just finding the ones that work for you. What grounding techniques work for me might not be the same that are helpful for you. If you think about it in this way, it can help you kind of build a really custom set of skills that you can put in your toolbox to work for you when you need it in your specific circumstances. The real benefit of being grounded and being present is that the hard things in our life are less hard if we're present, and the fun things are more fun. When you think about having like a really long day at work, being not present makes it even longer. When you're standing behind the counter, dreading every second, staring at the clock, thinking about what you could be doing with your time, versus if you're just really present and focused on what you're doing. The same thing goes for when we're in the good times. If we're not present, we're thinking about the bad things that have happened or the potential scary things in the future. We're not being present and enjoying the moment we're in. Think of a time that you played a sport or a game or anything like that. If you're all the way in that, it feels really good. If you're trying to do that thing while your mind is somewhere else, it becomes really difficult and a lot less enjoyable. So try some of the grounding techniques that I've talked about, or watch the channel for some shorts talking about more grounding techniques, or check out that list in the description and really practice some and figure out what works for you. Grounding techniques are one of the most foundational parts of good mental health, so check it out.
Thanks for visiting our page today. Hopefully something that we have talked about has been helpful, whether it's the definition of a trigger, some interventions to use, or some steps to take to more effectively manage and or reduce these triggers. Like and subscribe if you haven't already for any of the newest content. Thank you.